There are moments that split your life into before and after, though you never see them coming. They arrive disguised as ordinary evenings, as casual suggestions, as the kind of thing that happens between friends who've run out of better ideas. I was 19 that late summer, lying on Kai's narrow twin bed in our dorm room that always smelled like the intersection of old textbooks and whatever citrus body spray he'd gotten from his sister. The air was thick and warm, the kind of heat that makes everything feel slower, more deliberate. Outside our window, the campus was settling into that golden hour when the light turns everything soft and forgiving. We'd just finished watching some romantic comedy from the 90s that Kai had found on his laptop. Something with Meg Ryan, probably. The kind of movie where the boy always gets the girl, where love is simple and predetermined and arrives right on schedule. The credits were rolling, and the room had fallen into that particular quiet that follows shared entertainment, when you're both waiting for someone to suggest what comes next. Kai was lying beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. He'd had a can of hard cider earlier, just one, but enough to bring a flush to his cheeks that hadn't quite faded. I was propped up on one elbow, trying to look casual, trying to ignore the way my heart was racing beneath what I'd always considered my carefully maintained exterior. He rolled onto his side to face me, and I could see something working behind his eyes. A thought forming, gaining weight and momentum. When he spoke, his voice carried that particular brand of false casualness that people use when they're about to suggest something they've been thinking about for longer than they want to admit. "We should practice," he said. "You know, for girls." I laughed. What else could I do? The sound came out easier than I felt, and I was grateful for that small mercy. But even as I was laughing, something deep in my chest was already shifting, already knowing that this moment was different from all the others that had come before it. "Practice," I repeated, as if testing the word, seeing how it felt in my mouth. Kai nodded, his grin a little too wide, a little too forced. "Just to get better at it," he said. "So we're not completely hopeless next time." And here's the thing I couldn't tell him, the thing I'd been carrying alone for longer than I cared to count. I didn't need practice for girls. I'd known since I was 14, maybe earlier, that girls weren't going to be the source of my particular brand of heartbreak. But Kai didn't know that. Nobody knew that. I'd built my life around the careful architecture of that secret, and I wasn't about to let it crumble now. Not like this. Not with him looking at me like he was waiting for an answer. So I played along. I agreed. What choice did I have? We started awkward, of course. A brief meeting of lips that was more collision than kiss. Both of us too aware of what we were doing, too conscious of the strangeness of it. We pulled apart and laughed, the nervous kind of laughter that fills up space where words should be. Then we tried again, slower this time, with more intention. And then once more, because the second attempt had been better, more natural, and there was something in the way Kai's hand had come up to rest against my shoulder that made me think maybe this wasn't entirely about practice after all. But it was the fourth kiss that changed everything. The one where I forgot to pretend, forgot to treat it like research or preparation or anything other than what it actually was. The one where I felt Kai relax against me, his breath catching slightly when our mouths found a rhythm that felt less like experimenting and more like discovering something that had always been there, waiting. When we finally pulled apart, there was no laughter this time. Just silence and the sound of our breathing and the distant noise of other students somewhere else in the building, living their uncomplicated lives. Kai's eyes searched my face for something I wasn't sure I was ready to show him. The flush in his cheeks had deepened, and there was a vulnerability in his expression that I'd never seen before, not in all the months we'd been roommates, not in all the late nights we'd spent talking about everything except the things that mattered most. "Can we?" he said, and then stopped. Started again. "Can we do it again tomorrow?" The question hung in the air between us like something physical, something I could reach out and touch. And in that moment, I felt the ground shift beneath me, felt the careful structure of who I thought I was and who I thought he was begin to rearrange itself into something new and terrifying and impossibly fragile. I knew then, in the pit of my stomach where certainty lives, that nothing would ever be the same. Not between us, not in this room, Not in the way I moved through the world pretending that my heart was a simple thing with simple wants. The practice was over, even if we were going to keep calling it that for a while longer. What came next was going to be real and messy, and nothing like the movies we just finished watching. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady when I answered. Yeah, I said. Yeah, we can do it again tomorrow. I should probably tell you how we got there, Kai and I, to that moment on his bed when everything shifted. Because it didn't happen in a vacuum. It was built on a foundation of 1,000 smaller moments, a year's worth of learning how to exist in the same space without stepping on each other's carefully constructed boundaries. I was 19 then, a sophomore majoring in architecture. I'd chosen the field because I liked the idea of structure, of rules that didn't change depending on who was applying them. There's something comforting about load-bearing walls and foundation requirements, about the way a building either stands or it doesn't. No gray areas, no room for interpretation. I spent most of my free time in the studio lab, headphones on, working with design software until my eyes burned and the security guard had to kick me out. I lived in a suite with 3 other guys, but it was Kai I'd ended up closest to. We'd been randomly assigned as roommates freshman year, and somehow the arrangement had stuck. The housing department had offered to split us up when we applied for sophomore housing, but neither of us had taken them up on it. By then, we'd developed a rhythm that worked. Kai was everything I wasn't. Spontaneous where I was methodical, magnetic where I was careful, always halfway to saying yes to whatever dare or adventure someone threw his way. He made friends in elevators and dining hall lines, the kind of person who could walk into a party where he knew nobody and leave with 3 new phone numbers and an invitation to someone's lake house. He called everyone bro, but when he said it to me, it sounded different. Like he was saying he saw me, really saw me, in a way that most people didn't bother to. Our room was small, even by dorm standards. 2 twin beds separated by maybe 5 feet of linoleum floor, 2 desks that had seen better decades, and a window that looked out onto the courtyard where people played frisbee and pretended to study when the weather was nice. We made it work, though. Kai had hung string lights around his side, and I'd covered my wall with architectural prints I'd found at a used bookstore downtown. His half looked like a festival waiting to happen. Mine looked like a library. Living 5 feet apart for over a year strips away certain kinds of pretense. You learn things about another person that you never intended to know. The sound they make when they're trying not to laugh during a serious phone call with their parents. How they look first thing in the morning before they've had time to assemble their public face. The specific way they breathe when they're falling asleep. But it doesn't strip away everything. Some secrets you hold closer, guard more carefully, especially when proximity makes them more dangerous rather than less. I'd known about myself since I was maybe 14, that slow dawning awareness that what I felt when I looked at other boys was different from what I was supposed to feel. By the time I got to college, I'd made a kind of peace with it, but a quiet peace. The kind that involved not asking too many questions about what I wanted or needed from other people. It seemed safer that way, cleaner, especially when it came to Kai. We'd built our friendship around shared routines that felt safe in their predictability. Laundry on Sunday afternoons, when the machines were less crowded, and we could sit in the basement common room and argue about whose turn it was to buy detergent. Late-night food runs to the 24-hour diner off campus, splitting orders of fries and coffee that was strong enough to keep us awake through whatever deadline was looming next. Study sessions that were more talking than studying, sprawled across our respective beds with textbooks open and music playing low enough not to bother our suite mates. We had inside jokes that nobody else understood, references built up over months of shared experiences. The way Kai would mutter our RA's catchphrases under his breath during floor meetings. How I'd started leaving architectural sketches on his desk when he was stressed about exams. Little geometric patterns that meant nothing to anyone else, but somehow always made him smile. There was an easiness to it all that I treasured, maybe more than I should have. The way Kai would steal my hoodies without asking and wear them to class, bringing them back smelling like his cologne and whatever hand soap they had in the academic buildings. How he'd wait for me if I was running late to dinner, even when his other friends were already heading to the dining hall. The comfortable silences we could fall into while doing homework. Both of us focused on our own work, but aware of each other's presence in that peripheral way that roommates develop. But underneath all of that comfort, underneath the easy friendship and the shared space and the thousand small intimacies of living with another person, there was something else. Something I'd been careful not to name or examine too closely, because I knew that once I started looking at it directly, it would be impossible to ignore. The way I found myself watching Kai when he didn't know I was looking. How my attention would snag on the unconscious things he did. The way he'd run his hands through his hair when he was thinking, or tap his pen against his lips while reading. How I'd started timing my own schedule around his, making sure I was in the room when he got back from class, available when he wanted to talk through whatever was on his mind. I told myself it was just friendship. Close friendship, the kind that people write songs about and make movies about, but friendship nonetheless. I told myself that the flutter in my chest when he laughed at something I'd said was normal, that the way I felt protective of his moods and invested in his successes was what any good friend would feel. But I knew, in the part of my mind that I tried not to visit too often, that I was lying to myself. Had been lying to myself for months, maybe since the beginning. Because friends don't catalog the exact shade of their roommate's eyes when the light hits them a certain way. Friends don't lose track of conversations because they've gotten distracted by the way someone's mouth moves when they talk. Friends don't lie awake at night listening to another person breathe and feeling their own heartbeat speed up in response. I'd gotten good at the compartmentalization, though, at keeping those thoughts locked away where they couldn't complicate the good thing we had going. Because what we had was good, even if it wasn't everything I sometimes found myself wanting. It was stable and uncomplicated and safe, and I'd learned not to ask for more than that. Until that evening with the romantic comedy and the hard cider and Kai's suggestion that we should practice. Until the moment when all my careful compartmentalization started to crack, and I realized that maybe I wasn't the only one who'd been lying about what this thing between us actually was. The thing that changed everything started, like most disasters, with someone else's heartbreak. Her name was Claire, and she was in Kai's philosophy class. I'd heard about her for weeks leading up to what happened, these casual mentions woven into his daily updates about professors and assignments and campus gossip. Claire who always sat in the front row. Claire who had strong opinions about Nietzsche. Claire who'd asked to borrow his notes and then invited him for coffee to discuss them. I'd listened to all of it with the carefully neutral expression I'd perfected over the months, nodding at the right moments, and asking follow-up questions that demonstrated interest without revealing the tightness in my chest every time her name came up. Because that's what good friends do. They're supportive of each other's romantic endeavors, even when those endeavors feel like small knives being twisted in places you didn't know were vulnerable. Kai had been cautiously optimistic about Claire in the way that people are when they're afraid to want something too much. They'd gone on a few dates, nothing too serious, but enough that he'd started mentioning weekend plans that included her, enough that he'd begun checking his phone more frequently for texts that might or might not come. Then, on a Tuesday in late September, it all fell apart. I came back from my structural engineering class to find Kai sitting on his bed, staring at his phone with the kind of expression usually reserved for unexpected deaths or failed exams. He looked up when I walked in, and I could see immediately that something fundamental had shifted in his world. She ended it, he said, without preamble. Just like that. Said she didn't think we were compatible long-term. I set my backpack down carefully, buying myself time to arrange my face into something appropriately sympathetic. I'm sorry, I said, and I was. Not sorry that Claire was out of the picture, but sorry that Kai was hurt. There's a difference, though I wasn't sure I could have explained it to anyone else. For the next few days, Kai moved through our shared space like someone recovering from minor surgery. Not dramatically wounded, but tender in ways that made him flinch when things touched wrong. He went to class and came back with reports about seeing Claire across the lecture hall, about how she'd smiled politely when their eyes met, but hadn't made any move to approach him. He analyzed their last conversation over and over, picking apart word choices and inflections like he was looking for the exact moment when things had gone sideways. I listened to all of it, offered what comfort I could without getting too close. Because there's a delicate balance to maintaining when your roommate is heartbroken over someone you never wanted him to be with in the first place. Too much sympathy, and you risk sounding false. Too little, and you risk seeming callous. I aimed for somewhere in the middle, for the kind of steady presence that suggested I cared about his feelings without having any particular investment in the outcome. The breakthrough came on a Friday night, after we'd been to a party in one of the upperclassmen dorms. It was the kind of gathering that happened every weekend, cramped apartments full of people drinking cheap beer and pretending to have more fun than they actually were. We'd stayed longer than usual, mostly because Kai seemed determined to prove to himself that he could have a good time despite recent events. On the walk back to our dorm, he threw his arm around my shoulders in the loose, casual way that people do when they've had just enough to drink to feel affectionate toward the world in general. The night air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the campus was quiet except for the distant sound of other people making their way home from their own Friday night adventures. "You're lucky you don't fall in love," he said, his voice carrying that particular brand of philosophical sadness that alcohol tends to inspire. "Girls ruin everything." I smiled, because what else could I do? Because how could I explain that I did fall in love, just not with girls, and that standing there with his arm around me was both the best and worst part of my entire week? Because how could I tell him that the reason I seemed immune to romantic complications was that all of my romantic complications were standing right next to me, warm and solid, and completely unaware of the effect he was having? Later that night, back in our room, both of us sprawled across our respective beds in that loose-limbed way that comes after a long evening of social performance. Kai brought it up again. The kissing thing. The practice. I should have seen it coming. Should have recognized the way his mind was working, the connection he was drawing between his recent romantic failure and his perceived need for improvement. But I was caught off guard by the suggestion, by the casual way he threw it out like it was just another solution to just another problem. "We should practice," he said, staring up at the ceiling. "Kissing, I mean. So we're not completely hopeless next time." And there it was. The moment I'd been both dreading and hoping for without even realizing it. The invitation to cross a line that I'd been carefully avoiding even looking at directly. I hesitated, because of course I hesitated. Because saying yes felt dangerous in ways I wasn't sure I was ready for, and saying no felt like closing a door that might never open again. Because I could see the logic in his suggestion from his perspective, the way it made perfect sense as a practical solution to a practical problem, while from my perspective it felt like the most loaded proposition anyone had ever made. But then he grinned at me, that easy smile that had gotten us both into and out of trouble since freshman year, and said it wasn't that serious. "Come on," he said. "It's just practice. Just practice." As if there was anything simple about it. As if the idea of kissing him, even under the guise of preparation for other people, wasn't the most serious thing I could imagine. But I agreed, because how could I not? Because the alternative was explaining why I couldn't, and that explanation would require admitting things I wasn't ready to admit. So I agreed, and we kissed, and it was everything I'd imagined and nothing like I'd expected all at the same time. The next morning, I woke up expecting everything to be different. Expecting awkwardness or regret, or the kind of careful distance that people create when they've accidentally gone too far. Instead, Kai handed me a cup of coffee he'd made with the little machine his mother had sent him and asked if I wanted to do the same thing that night. "Same time tonight," he said, like we were talking about studying together or watching another movie. And that's how it started. How we fell into a routine that felt both completely natural and utterly surreal. Every night that week, after dinner and homework and all the ordinary business of being college students, we'd find our way back to the same conversation, the same suggestion, the same careful crossing of lines that weren't supposed to be crossed. Always framed as practice. Always presented as preparation for future romantic encounters with other people. Always ending too soon, with Kai rolling back to his own bed and saying good night like nothing extraordinary had just happened. I tried not to hope. Tried to treat it like what he said it was, just two friends helping each other improve their technique. But every time he asked if we could do it again, every time he said the word again like a question that needed answering, something inside me trembled with the possibility that maybe this meant something more than practice after all. Something shifted during the second week, though I couldn't have pinpointed exactly when or how. It was gradual, like the way seasons change without you noticing until one day you realize the air feels different and the light falls at new angles, and everything you thought you knew about the landscape has quietly rearranged itself. The kisses grew longer. That was the first thing I noticed. The way what had started as brief experiments began to stretch into something more sustained, more deliberate. Where before we'd pulled apart after a few seconds, now we'd find ourselves lingering, neither of us quite ready to be the first to break the connection. Our bodies pressed closer too, until the careful distance we'd maintained at the beginning dissolved entirely, and we were lying against each other in ways that had nothing to do with technique or preparation. The laughter disappeared. That easy, nervous energy that had characterized our first attempts gave way to something heavier, more charged. The silence that followed our kisses wasn't comfortable anymore, wasn't the kind of quiet that comes after shared amusement. It was thick with things neither of us was saying, weighted with questions that hung in the air like smoke. We stopped talking about girls entirely. I'm not sure when that happened, when the conversations that had always been threaded with mentions of Claire or observations about attractive classmates or theoretical discussions about future relationships just quietly evaporated. It wasn't a conscious decision on either of our parts, more like those references simply became irrelevant to whatever we were doing, whatever space we were occupying together in the dark. I found myself watching Kai during the day in ways I'd never let myself watch him before. Not just the casual observation that comes from living in close quarters, but something more focused, more hungry. I cataloged the small gestures he made when he was nervous, the way he'd rub the back of his neck while staring at his textbooks, the particular expression that crossed his face in the moments just before we kissed. I started to wonder what he was thinking during those moments, what was happening behind his eyes when they went soft and unfocused just before his mouth found mine. There was one night, maybe 2 weeks into our routine, when everything felt different from the moment we settled onto his bed. The air in the room seemed heavier, more electric, and when we kissed, it was with an intensity that left us both breathing harder than usual. When we finally pulled apart, instead of rolling away like he normally did, Kai stayed close. Close enough that I could feel his breath against my skin when he spoke. "This doesn't feel fake," he whispered, his forehead still pressed against mine. I didn't respond. Couldn't respond. Because acknowledging what he'd said would mean acknowledging what we were really doing, and I wasn't sure either of us was ready for that conversation. So I just lay there, feeling the weight of his words settle into the space between us like something physical, something that would have to be dealt with eventually, but not tonight. Not yet. The days began to take on a strange double quality, as if we were living 2 separate lives that existed in the same physical space, but operated according to completely different rules. During daylight hours, we maintained the careful choreography of roommates who had nothing more complicated than friendship between them. We avoided eye contact during meals with our suite mates, spoke to each other in the same casual tones we'd always used, went about our individual schedules of classes and studying and social obligations as if nothing had changed. But underneath all that normalcy, there was a constant awareness of each other that felt new and overwhelming. I'd catch myself losing track of conversations because I was wondering what Kai was doing, where he was, when he'd be back to the room. I'd find excuses to return to our dorm between classes, telling myself I needed to pick up a forgotten textbook or check my email, when really I just wanted to see if he was there, if maybe we could steal a few minutes alone together before the evening came, and we could stop pretending. At night, though, we found our way back to each other with the inevitability of water finding its level. No matter how distant we'd been during the day, no matter how carefully we'd avoided acknowledging what was happening between us in the presence of other people, when the sun went down and our suite mates settled into their own routines, we'd gravitate toward each other like planets locked in orbit. I started sketching obsessively during this period, carrying my notebook with me everywhere and filling page after page with abstract shapes and half-formed figures that seemed to emerge from my pen without conscious direction. lines that curved in ways that reminded me of the slope of someone's shoulder, geometric patterns that somehow captured the rhythm of breathing and sleep, and increasingly, faces that looked suspiciously like Kai's, though I told myself I was just practicing figure drawing, working on my technique for the architectural rendering classes I'd be taking next semester. The sketching became a way to process what I couldn't say out loud, to give shape to feelings that seemed too large and complicated for words. I'd find myself drawing during lectures, my attention split between whatever the professor was explaining and the movement of my hand across the page, creating images that felt both foreign and familiar, like messages from a part of myself I was only beginning to understand. It was during one of these extended sketching sessions that everything shifted again. I'd fallen asleep at my desk sometime after midnight, my head pillowed on my arms and my notebook still open in front of me. When I woke up a few hours later, the first gray light of dawn was filtering through our window, and there was a crick in my neck from sleeping in an awkward position. But that wasn't what made me freeze in place, barely breathing. It was the realization that Kai was awake, sitting up in his bed, watching me, not just glancing over because I'd made some noise in my sleep, but really watching, with the kind of focused attention that suggested he'd been doing it for a while. There was something in his expression I'd never seen before, something vulnerable and hungry and terrified all at once. When our eyes met, he didn't look away immediately like he might have in any other context. Instead, we stared at each other across the small distance between his bed and my desk, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me, some last wall of pretense crumble away entirely. He looked terrified, but he also looked like he didn't want to stop looking, like whatever he was seeing when he watched me sleep was something he'd been trying to understand for longer than either of us had been willing to admit. I should have said something. Should have asked him what he was thinking, or told him what I was feeling, or found some way to bridge the gap between all the things we were doing in the dark and all the things we couldn't bring ourselves to say in the light. But I was scared too, scared of what his answer might be, scared of pushing too hard and losing what we had, even if what we had was built on increasingly shaky foundations of denial and misdirection. So I didn't say anything, just looked back at him until he finally turned away, settling back into his pillow with a quiet sigh that could have meant anything or nothing. Still, nobody said what we were doing. It was easier to let it stay undefined, to maintain the fiction that this was still practice, still preparation for some theoretical future with theoretical other people. The word practice had become a kind of talisman between us, a way to explain the unexplainable without having to examine it too closely. But the practice was changing us both, whether we wanted to admit it or not. I could see it in the way Kai moved through the world now, more uncertain than before, like someone who discovered that the ground beneath his feet wasn't as solid as he'd always assumed. I could feel it in myself too, in the way my attention had narrowed until it felt like most of my emotional energy was focused on the few square feet of space we shared when the rest of the world went to sleep. We were becoming different people, and we were becoming them together, in the dark, without words, one kiss at a time. The weekend when everything changed started like most of the good things in my life have started, quietly and without warning. It was early October, one of those weekends when half the campus empties out for fall break or home football games or family obligations that pull people back to whatever version of themselves they were before college. Our suite mates had both left Friday afternoon, one heading home to help his parents move and the other driving 3 hours south to visit his girlfriend at another school. By Saturday morning, our hallway had the particular kind of silence that comes when most of the rooms are empty, when you can hear your own footsteps echoing in ways they normally don't. Kai and I had both stayed behind. I told my parents I had too much work to make the trip home worthwhile, which was true enough, though not the whole truth. Kai had mentioned something about not wanting to deal with his family's questions about his non-existent love life, which I'd understood without needing further explanation. It rained all day Saturday. Not the dramatic thunderstorm kind of rain that clears the air and makes everything feel renewed, but the steady, persistent drizzle that makes the whole world seem smaller and more intimate. The kind of weather that keeps you indoors whether you want to be there or not. that turns even large spaces into something that feels contained and separate from everything else. We spent the morning in that easy way that people do when they have nowhere else to be and no particular agenda to follow. Kai worked on a paper for his ethics class while I caught up on reading for my history of architecture course. We barely spoke, but it was the comfortable kind of silence that we'd perfected over months of coexistence, punctuated only by the sound of pages turning and the rain against our window. Around noon, we got hungry and realized that the dining halls were operating on reduced weekend hours and we'd missed lunch. So we pooled our resources and walked through the drizzle to the small grocery store near campus, coming back with ingredients for the kind of meal that college students make when they're trying to be resourceful. Cheap pasta, a jar of marinara sauce, and a bag of pre-shredded cheese that we'd convinced ourselves counted as cooking. We made it together in the communal kitchen at the end of our hallway, taking turns stirring the sauce and debating whether the pasta was actually done or just getting close. There was something domestic about the whole process that felt both foreign and natural, like we were playing house in a way that was more serious than either of us wanted to acknowledge. Afterward, we brought our bowls back to our room and ate sitting on the floor between our beds, backs against the wall, playing cards with a worn deck that Kai had found in his desk drawer. Nothing high stakes, just the kind of mindless games that fill time and create space for conversation to happen naturally. The rain kept falling, and the afternoon stretched out in front of us like something we could shape however we wanted. There was an easiness between us that I hadn't felt in weeks, a return to the simple comfort that had characterized our friendship before everything got complicated. We laughed at each other's terrible poker faces and argued about whether gin rummy had too many rules to be worth playing and generally existed in the same space without the electric tension that had been building between us for days. Until Kai asked the question that changed everything. We'd been playing for maybe an hour when he set his cards down and looked at me with the kind of expression that meant he'd been thinking about something for a while and had finally worked up the courage to say it out loud. "Have you ever kissed anyone before me?" he asked, his voice quiet enough that I almost missed it over the sound of rain. The question hung in the air between us like something physical, something that required a response, but that I wasn't sure how to approach. Because the honest answer was complicated in ways that I wasn't ready to explain, that would require admitting things about myself that I'd been carefully avoiding. I hesitated, turning the question over in my mind and trying to figure out how much truth I was prepared to offer. Then, finally, I said no. It wasn't entirely accurate. There had been a girl in high school, Sarah Chun, who'd kissed me at a party during senior year when we were both drunk enough to think it might be interesting. But it had lasted maybe 10 seconds and felt like exactly what it was, an experiment that confirmed what I'd already suspected about myself. It didn't seem relevant to what Kai was asking, to the larger question of experience that I could tell was behind his curiosity. Kai nodded, thoughtful, like my answer had confirmed something he'd been wondering about. Then, after a moment that felt much longer than it probably was, he said me neither. And suddenly the easiness was gone, replaced by something much more charged and dangerous. Because if neither of us had kissed anyone else, then whatever we'd been doing together wasn't practice at all. It was just us, figuring out what we wanted from each other without the cover story we'd been hiding behind. We went back to playing cards, but the game felt different now, like we were both aware of the conversation we'd just had and what it meant for all the conversations we hadn't been having. The rain kept falling, and the afternoon light grew dimmer, and eventually we gave up on gin rummy entirely and just sat there looking at each other across the scattered cards. That night, when we kissed, it was different from all the times before. Slower at first, more deliberate, like we were both finally admitting to ourselves what we were really doing. But then it deepened in ways that our previous encounters hadn't, became something hungrier and more urgent. Our hands wandered to places they hadn't been before, exploring the territory of each other's bodies with a boldness that surprised us both. I lost track of time, lost track of everything except the warmth of Kai's skin and the sound of his breathing, and the way he said my name when I touched him in ways that made him arch against me. We fell asleep tangled together, my head on his chest and his arm around my shoulders, And for the first time in weeks, I didn't lie awake afterward analyzing what had happened or worrying about what it meant. When I woke up the next morning, I was alone. Not just alone in Kai's bed, but alone in the room entirely. His bed was made with the kind of military precision that suggested he'd been awake for a while, and his textbooks were gone from his desk, along with the jacket he'd been wearing the day before. The only sign that he'd been there at all was a yellow sticky note stuck to my desk, the kind we used for mundane roommate communications about whose turn it was to buy toilet paper or when we'd be back from class. This one just said, "Went for a walk. Needed to think." I stared at that note for a long time, trying to read between the lines and figure out what kind of thinking required him to pack his textbooks like he might not be coming back anytime soon. I waited all day, alternating between trying to focus on homework and checking my phone for texts that never came and listening for his footsteps in the hallway. He didn't return until evening, just as the sun was setting, and I'd started to wonder if maybe he really wasn't coming back at all. When he walked through the door, he looked different. Not just tired, though he was obviously that, but distant in a way that made the room feel bigger and colder than it had ever felt before. He didn't meet my eyes when he spoke. "I'm not like you," he said, and I knew immediately what he meant even though we'd never talked about what I was like, what either of us was like, in any explicit terms. I didn't respond. Couldn't respond. Because what was there to say to that? That I'd known all along that he wasn't like me? That I'd been hoping anyway? That the night we'd just shared had felt like the most honest thing either of us had ever done, regardless of what it meant about who we were or what we wanted? Kai stood there for a moment longer, looking like he wanted to say something else, but couldn't find the words for it. Then he grabbed some clothes from his dresser and left again, and I heard his footsteps fade down the hallway until the building was quiet again. I felt the collapse inside me like a building folding in on itself. All the careful architecture of hope and possibility, and maybe that I'd been constructing over the past few weeks suddenly reduced to rubble. Because I'd known this moment would come eventually, had been bracing for it, even while I let myself believe that maybe it wouldn't. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally are two entirely different things, and the reality of losing him felt like losing something I'd never actually had in the first place, but had somehow become essential to my ability to breathe. The silence that followed was different from any quiet we'd ever shared. Not the comfortable absence of words that comes from understanding, but something heavy and suffocating, thick with everything we weren't saying and probably never would. We didn't speak for days. Kai began avoiding the dorm with the precision of someone who'd made a careful study of my schedule. He'd leave before I woke up and return long after I'd gone to bed, though I could hear him moving around in the dark, the soft sounds of someone trying not to be noticed. On the rare occasions when our paths did cross, he'd nod politely and find urgent reasons to be somewhere else, as if we were strangers who happened to share the same living space through some administrative error. I stopped going to class, not intentionally at first, but I'd find myself sitting on my bed staring at the textbooks I was supposed to be reading, unable to make sense of words that had become meaningless arrangements of letters. The familiar routines that had structured my days felt impossible to navigate when every movement reminded me of how fundamentally everything had changed. The room itself seemed different now, smaller and larger at the same time. The 5 feet between our beds had become a chasm that felt unbridgeable, while the walls pressed in with the weight of memory and missed opportunity. I'd catch myself looking at his empty bed and remembering how it felt to sleep there, how his breathing had sounded when he was relaxed and unguarded. Then I'd force myself to look away and try to pretend that none of it had ever happened. Our suitemates returned from their weekend adventures full of stories and energy that felt foreign in the new atmosphere we'd created. They seemed to sense that something had shifted, though they couldn't have guessed what, and their attempts at normal conversation fell flat in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. I started spending more time in the library, not because I was getting any actual work done, but because it was easier to avoid thinking in a place that wasn't saturated with reminders of what I'd lost. The architecture building stayed open late, and I'd find excuses to wander the halls looking at student projects and professor exhibitions, trying to lose myself in other people's creative solutions to structural problems. It was on one of these aimless wandering sessions that I ran into Kai near the student center. I was coming out of the coffee shop with a cup I probably wasn't going to drink, and he was walking past with that quick, focused stride that meant he was late for something. We both stopped when we saw each other, caught in one of those moments where avoiding acknowledgement would have been more awkward than whatever brief interaction was about to happen. He looked tired in a way that went beyond normal college exhaustion, and there were shadows under his eyes that suggested he wasn't sleeping any better than I was. For a moment, I thought he might actually say something substantial, might try to bridge the gap that had opened between us. Instead, he looked at a point somewhere over my shoulder and muttered, "I didn't mean to hurt you." Then he walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with my cooling coffee and the realization that an apology, even a sincere one, wasn't going to be enough to fix what had broken between us. That night, I packed a bag, not with any real plan, just the sudden certainty that I couldn't spend another night in that room breathing the same air and pretending that everything was normal. I grabbed some clothes and my laptop and the notebook where I'd been sketching obsessively, and I left. The library closed at midnight, but the architecture building stayed open for students working on projects. I'd spent enough late nights there to know which areas were quiet after hours, which benches were comfortable enough to serve as temporary sleeping arrangements. The security guard knew me by sight and didn't ask questions when I settled in with my stuff outside the fabrication lab, just nodded and continued his rounds. I couldn't sleep, despite the exhaustion that had been building for days. Instead, I found myself drawing again, but not the abstract shapes and half-formed faces that had been filling my notebook. This time, I drew with the precision and attention to detail that I'd learned in my drafting classes, creating something that was part floor plan and part emotional archaeology. I drew our room, not just the physical layout, though that was there too, the exact dimensions and furniture placement and architectural details that defined the space we'd shared. But I also mapped the invisible geography of our relationship, the paths we'd traced between our beds and desks and the door, the specific locations where significant moments had occurred. I labeled everything. The corner where Kai always dropped his backpack after class. The spot on his bed where we'd first kissed. The window where we'd stood together watching other students cross the courtyard below before things got complicated. The desk where I'd left sketches that made him smile. The space between our beds where we'd had conversations that mattered before we stopped talking altogether. It took me most of the night to finish, working by the light of my laptop screen and the emergency lighting that stayed on in the hallways. When I was done, I had something that looked like a blueprint but felt like a confession, a technical drawing that somehow captured the emotional architecture of what we'd built and lost. I went back to the dorm early in the morning, while Kai was still asleep or pretending to be. I left the drawing on his desk, weighted down with a textbook so it wouldn't get lost among the other papers scattered there. Then I gathered some fresh clothes and left again before he woke up. I spent most of the next day in the library, alternating between trying to catch up on the work I'd been neglecting and staring out windows at students who seemed to be navigating their lives with an ease I couldn't remember ever feeling. I told myself I wasn't waiting for anything in particular, wasn't checking my phone every few minutes for texts that weren't going to come. It was late afternoon when he found me. I was sitting under a tree behind the library, one of those spots that feels hidden even though it's technically public space, reading the same page of a textbook over and over without absorbing any of it. I looked up and he was there, standing a few feet away like he wasn't sure whether approaching was the right decision. We looked at each other for a long moment, and I could see something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Not just the exhaustion and guilt that had characterized our recent interactions, but something softer, more uncertain. He looked like someone who'd been asking himself difficult questions and wasn't sure he liked the answers he was finding. He sat down next to me without asking permission, close enough that I could smell his familiar cologne mixed with the October air. For a while, we just sat there in silence, watching other students move across the quad in the distance, living their uncomplicated lives. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, he said, "I think I wanted you before I even knew it." The words settled between us like something fragile that required careful handling. I could have asked him to explain what he meant, could have demanded details about what had changed or when he'd figured it out or what he planned to do about it now. But those questions felt less important than the simple fact that he was here, that he'd sought me out, that he was trying to find words for something that had always felt too large and complicated for language. Instead of asking anything, I reached for his hand. Just that simple gesture, fingers linking together in the space between us on the grass. He didn't pull away. If anything, he held on tighter, like he was afraid I might disappear if he didn't anchor us both to this moment. We sat like that for a long time, until the sun started to set, and the air grew cool enough that we could see our breath. Until other students began heading inside for dinner and evening study sessions. Until the space under the tree felt like our own private world, separate from everything else that had been pulling us apart. When we finally got up to go back to the dorm, we walked slowly, neither of us eager to break whatever spell had settled over us. But for the first time in days, the silence between us felt like possibility rather than ending, like the beginning of a conversation we were finally ready to have. Time passed the way it does when you're not watching it closely, in quiet increments that accumulate into something new without announcing themselves. We were still roommates, still shared the same small space with its two twin beds, an overlooked window, and the string lights that Kai had hung months ago and never taken down. But the room felt different now, inhabited by different versions of ourselves, people who no longer needed to pretend that the 5 feet between our beds was an unbridgeable distance. We didn't kiss every night anymore. Sometimes we'd just talk, lying in the dark and sharing the kinds of thoughts that only emerge when you can't see the other person's face clearly. Sometimes we'd reach for each other without words, hands finding familiar territory, comfortable in a way that had nothing to do with practice or preparation. And sometimes we didn't touch at all, content to exist in the same space without needing anything more than the quiet assurance of each other's presence. The weight was gone. That suffocating pressure that had built up over weeks of pretending, of calling something practice when it was really discovery, of tiptoeing around truths that were too large to ignore. The pretending was gone too, replaced by something simpler and more honest, a way of being together that didn't require explanation or justification. I found the note on a Tuesday morning in late October, tucked between the pages of my sketchbook where I'd know to look for it. Kai's handwriting, careful and deliberate. No more practice. Just us. I kept that note, pressed it between the pages of my architectural history textbook like a bookmark, though I never needed it to remember where I'd left off reading. It felt important to preserve this small piece of evidence that we'd found our way to something real. There was no big announcement, no dramatic coming out or careful conversations with friends about what we were to each other now. We simply began existing as ourselves, without apology or explanation. Two boys who brushed their teeth side by side each morning, who shared hoodies and textbooks, and the comfortable silences that come from truly knowing another person. Our suitemates adapted to the shift with the easy acceptance that college students bring to most changes in their social environment. If they noticed that we'd stopped dating other people entirely, or that we sometimes fell asleep watching movies together on one of our beds, they didn't comment on it. Our friendship had always been close enough that the evolution felt natural rather than shocking. I started sleeping better, not just because the anxiety and uncertainty had lifted, but because I'd stopped fighting against what I wanted, stopped wasting energy on elaborate internal arguments about what was appropriate or safe or normal. The relief of that surrender was profound in ways I hadn't anticipated. Kai changed too, though more gradually. The easy confidence that had always characterized him returned, but tempered now with something deeper, more thoughtful. He'd always been the kind of person who made decisions quickly and adjusted courses needed. But there was a new deliberateness to the way he moved through the world, like someone who'd learned the difference between wanting something and knowing you want it. Winter arrived early that year, covering the campus in the kind of clean snow that makes everything look fresh and temporary. We developed new routines that accommodated the season, shared scarves and hot coffee, and the particular intimacy that comes from being warm together when the world outside is cold. It was on one of those crystalline December mornings, when the air was sharp enough to make your breath visible and the snow crunched under our feet as we walked to class, that Kai kissed me for no reason at all. Not because we'd been talking about anything romantic, not because we were alone in our room with nothing else to distract us, not because it was nighttime and the darkness made it easier to pretend we were someone else. Just because we were walking across campus together and he wanted to, because the impulse struck him and he didn't feel the need to question it or justify it or wrap it in explanations about practice or preparation. He stopped walking, turned to face me right there on the path between the library and the student center, and kissed me like it was the most natural thing in the world. Brief and sweet and utterly unself-conscious, the kind of gesture that couples make without thinking about it, without needing permission or excuse. When he pulled away, he smiled at me with that easy warmth I'd missed during the weeks when everything felt complicated and impossible. Then he kept walking like nothing extraordinary had happened, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, breath forming small clouds in the cold air. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't need a reason. Didn't need to analyze what the kiss meant or what it suggested about our future or how it fit into any larger narrative about who we were or what we wanted from each other. It was enough that it had happened. Enough that we were walking to class together in the snow, that we'd go back to our shared room afterward and exist in the same space without pretense or performance. Enough that we'd figured out how to be ourselves, together, without needing anyone else's understanding or approval. The story ends there, really, in that moment of walking through snow with someone who knows you well enough to kiss you for no reason other than wanting to. In the quiet revolution of becoming the people we actually were instead of the people we thought we were supposed to be. No dramatic revelations. No grand gestures. Just two boys who learned to be honest about what they wanted and discovered that honesty was revolutionary enough.